Good morning. Good morning, and welcome to WIDA's Trade and Technology Summit. I can ask folks to please be seated. We're delighted to welcome you all here today, whether you're joining us in person, online via Zoom, or on C-SPAN. WIDA is the International Trade Membership Association with members across the United States and around the world joining us today from 16 different countries. Welcome. Big thanks to our sponsors who made today's event possible: Amazon, the Consumer Technology Association, Coupang, the Information Technology Industry Council, National Foreign Trade Council, Silverado Policy Accelerator, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the World Trade Center DC, and the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center are hosts in this wonderful venue. Thank you. And thanks to your support, we're able to host nearly 300 government officials from around the world, both in person and online, thanks to the support of our sponsors. So thanks again for that. We have a packed schedule today, so we won't have lengthy introductions of all our speakers. But you should have a QR code on your table or one that was sent around to folks watching online, so you can download the program and you can read the biographies of our speakers here. And if you're watching on Zoom, I can't promise which sessions, but we'll try to get to questions from our online guests as well. So thank you. Now, after we just had a lovely breakfast networking event. We try to host events both in person and online at WIDA. And now we're ready to get started with our event today. We have a fireside chat to get things started. I want to welcome to the stage Ambassador Rick Switzer, the Deputy United States Trade Representative in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and our moderator, Gary Shapiro, the CEO and Vice Chair of the Consumer Technology Association, and the author of Pivot or Die, which is his new book that's available in the foyer for those of you who have joined us in person. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Rick, for joining us today.
Wow, thank you for that introduction. It's a little brief, but it's okay. Ambassador, we're so happy to have you here. Looking at the guest list of people that are attending this, you attract a lot of attention. You're very important, obviously, and it takes, given the audience here, I'd say that 95% of the people are here to hear you directly because you are helping lead one of the most fundamental changes in economic policy the United States has ever had. And it's something which is quite a big deal for a lot of companies, a lot of people, and certainly the American consumer based on polls, based on everything else. I have a series of questions I'd like to ask you. You've worked on China since the very beginning. We were talking about that before we went on. I've talked about for 15 years. In my first book, The Comeback, with a foreword by Mark Cuban, I start out talking about the danger that China threatens the United States and the world in terms of its focus on taking over a lot of manufacturing, and we had to elevate ourselves. And I gave a prescription for the government for that, which wasn't followed, unfortunately, but the thoughts are still valid. So the question is, there's a lot of things that China does, like forced technology transfer. They have a culture of copying without authorization, and they have market access restrictions, which are unfair, and they hurt American businesses. What are you doing about these in trade negotiations and enforcement of the Phase 1 deal?
Yeah, I think, fundamentally, I think that the question probably should be reframed in some ways, right? I don't think there's any fundamental way to open the Chinese market and to force them to play by sort of fair reciprocal rules. I think that was, there was a good faith effort made in the first Trump administration. Frankly, it was the first time the U.S. government ever sat down and really did try to hold China to account and try to come up with a set of principles and structures that were designed to essentially force reciprocity. For a generation, folks have thought about, access to the China market and how that would be beneficial to all. And you had WTO accession, and to be honest with you, more than a generation, quite literally in the 1800s, American, traders and European sort of trading houses had imagined the value of accessing the China market. It is something that has sort of captured the mind of sort of commercial interests in the West for many, many generations. The problem with that entire enterprise was that it often ignored the specific cultural sort of intuition of Chinese policymakers. And by that I mean they have always looked at foreign trade as a zero-sum enterprise. And that, despite the rhetoric, that is how they view it today as well. There really is a finite pie, and in their mind, anyone who gets a slice of pie in their market is de facto a loss for their producers. But they are very excited to get as much of the international pie as they can get. And this is played out through their 5-year plans. For instance, if you read through any of the 5-year plans going back to the 12th or 11th 5-year plan, long before Made in China 2025, China had identified segments of its economy where China would produce X percent of that market. So one of the oldest ones actually is from the second 5-year plan. It's affectionately known as the Great Leap Forward to most folks, but most folks don't realize the Great Leap Forward was literally just part of the second 5-year plan. That was just the name they gave it. It also happens to be the greatest man-made disaster in human history. Killed about 30 million people for an industrial policy. That industrial policy basically said China would be the largest producer of steel and iron and aluminum by X date. That was a zero-sum account. Right? It wasn't China would become exceptionally efficient and would build factories that could compete with the world. It was, here is the pie, and we will have this percentage of the pie. And in order to meet our goal, that means someone else has to lose. Now, we see that in semiconductors today. We've already seen this happen in rare earths, in magnets, and we're not seeing it in NEVs. All these things have a very long history of defining a market, defining percentages of the market that China will take, and then using any tool at their disposal in order to meet their goal.
But here we are, though, in the Ronald Reagan building. President Reagan spoke out forcefully against tariffs. Virtually every Republican president until this one has. And in less than 1 year, the world has totally changed. So now that every country in the world is looking at the U.S. differently, it's not a bastion of free trade it was. It's not the shining light it was. And here we are, and we're dealing with this in this building. So how do you perceive that in terms of the world focused on tariffs? President Reagan warned it invites retaliation and trade wars. It obviously causes inflation and raises prices. Tariffs are taxes. The Supreme Court heard the arguments on that, and many of the justices seem rather persuaded of the fact that tariffs are taxes. How do we switch this boat called the United States, a big ship, around so quickly so the rest of the world views us differently? And how do you view your role in that?
So, not to be overly confrontational, but I reject pretty much every premise. Reagan was in a world where it was a U.S. bloc, the Soviet communist bloc, including China, were outside of the normal trading regime, and so they weren't really participating in it. In that world, being anti-tariff made sense. In the post-China entering WTO world, that didn't make sense any longer. So, and Reagan did a ton of stuff on industrial policy that were not tariff related, but he was very willing to use industrial policy tools to go after semiconductors, to go after Japanese autos. There were a series of non-tariff restrictions on Japanese auto trade in the United States that were forced on the Japanese, to be quite fair, by USTR, also to be fair. And so Reagan was very comfortable using the tools that worked at the time. Reagan today, I would argue, would understand that tariffs would have to be a part of the equation if he were coming into the presidency right now and looking at what happened after China entered in WTO. So I'd put that out there first. I reject the notion that tariffs are inflationary. They're not inflationary. As a matter of fact, the last time we raised tariffs actually led to a deflationary cycle in the United States. A one-time increase in imported goods is not inflationary by any definition. If you look at, for instance, where most average folks consume their goods, their housing, their energy, their health care, and their food, almost none of those are traded goods. So the basket of goods that comes into the average consumer that's actually a traded good is around 20%. If you had a one-time increase, and we've talked to a lot of folks and looked at our own models, talked to most of the biggest investment firms and banks, many of the very, very best from Wall Street have told us, we expect to maybe see a 4 to 5% increase in prices over the next couple of quarters based upon the tariffs that have come in. If you take that 4 or 5% off of 20% of consumed goods, that's a very small one-time price increase. So, and the reduction in energy and the regulatory reductions will allow the economy to grow. So at a rate that is not inflationary. So we are dealing with a previous inflationary cycle that was driven by a previous government's overspending and overregulation and decrease in output and supply. So we have a supply constrained environment because we're not producing, which has driven inflation more than anything else. So that I also reject. I also reject the notion that tariffs are taxes. They're not taxes. Not even fundamentally close to taxes. First of all, taxes are not born essentially in a one-third, one-third, one-third ratio, right? If I tax you, you pay the tax. If the U.S. government puts a tariff on it, China reduces they lower the value of their currency on purpose in order to make it so that they can eat part of that. Their producers eat some of the costs. Some of the costs are passed along through the wholesalers internally through efficiency and other things. And literally maybe a third of the actual costs finally going to Americans who pay at one point. But you're protecting a whole other layer of American taxpayers. And one of the reasons why we run a massive trade or massive fiscal deficit is because we have destroyed millions of factory jobs that were middle-class jobs that paid taxes in the upper middle class. Every time you shut down a factory, you don't just take out the workers who work there. You take out the services, the investment tail, all the other folks who come and do the other work to keep that factory running. Most of those jobs pay far more than in the service industry itself. And so you destroyed in many communities entire tax bases. And when you destroy a tax base, you leave a situation where you have a very high-end tax base that is benefiting from globalization, who can protect their earnings from taxes, and you have a lower-end one who pay very little taxes. And so as you shrink that middle who actually pay their taxes and do not have the methods to pay a smaller percentage, and you have folks who at the bottom increasingly pay no taxes, what you've done is you've shrunk the tax base, which has led to increased deficits across the country. And one of the ways you can sort of reverse that is tariffs bring in revenue, but they also incentivize people to rebuild that industrial-based middle class. 1 million new industrial workers in the United States would lead to 3 or 4 million new high-paying jobs that would go along with it. Because every one of those factories, as I said, is going to have a services tail, a finance tail. You have the advanced robotics. You have all the other pieces that go along with those workers who work in a factory who typically don't get counted. And so now you're talking 3 or 4 or 5 million new upper middle class jobs. That's a lot of new upper middle class jobs providing income tax and a tax base to communities across America, to be fair, who have been completely left out of the globalization drive.
Well, I'd love to have a debate on that. I'll just agree to disagree because I do the shopping, food shopping in my family, and I'll tell you prices are pretty high on a whole range of things. And I know you could come up with exceptions and stories and things like that, but the 50% tax on cabinets, for example, being sold in the U.S. If you're buying a home or creating a home now, those are real price increases that Americans feel. And most Americans would agree that the polls show that Americans find least support for tariffs of anything. And that's why we had our Boston Tea Party. But I want to ask something we may agree on, which is that the fact that the tech industry is one of the bright lights of the American economy, and we're doing well. Through innovation, I think we have led the world, and we can continue to do so with good strategies. But we're finding American companies are facing restrictions in other countries on data flows and digital services. What's the USTR doing about that with reciprocal trade agreements? When there's restrictions by other countries, is there anything focusing on data flows and digital services you'd like to share?
Yeah, I mean, that's a priority of the president. We had an executive order that really tasked USTR and other elements of the U.S. government to push back on sort of repressive regulatory structures that increase taxes or regulatory burden on U.S. digital services and trade. U.S. Digital services and trade and increasingly AI-enabled services and software are going to be powerful drivers of both economic efficiency and productivity and wealth generation. And the United States stands at the forefront of all of that, as you noted. And so it's critical for USTR, in particular, as sort of the tip of the spear on this, but the entire U.S. government, to push back across the board on these structures. Many of them come out of Europe, to be fair. Europe, I would argue, has decided that it was too hard to do the innovation work. It was too hard to sort of reorder their economy to encourage entrepreneurship, to make it so that capital could reform in ways that you can in the United States, to support entrepreneurs in their drive to build new businesses, and that it was easier to try to regulate the U.S. And really throttle back U.S. leadership in such a way that they could maintain contact with us from a leadership perspective. What I mean is that the lead the U.S. is really taking on many of these technologies. Europe is actively trying to use a regulatory regime to slow the U.S. down so they can't get too far ahead of Europe. And we find this on AI, we find this on a number of other areas. And so fundamentally, we see this as regressive action that is targeted directly at the United States to make up for their own shortcomings. There are other elements of this around freedom of speech and some other elements that the administration, myself included, find to be very disturbing. But fundamentally, it's about using a regulatory state regime in order to sort of hem in your opponent. China uses a different methodology. Their methodologies have a fortress China approach, which is you just don't let U.S. digital firms compete in the China market. You try to take as much technology as you can. You put a ton of government subsidies into it, and then you go out and fight for global access. The U.S., on the other hand, has actually let most Chinese companies in on the digital side while being walled out from China for over 20 years. TikTok, which we sort of finally resolved for national security reasons, is a very good example of that, right? So all of TikTok's competitors from the U.S. were locked out of the China market for 20 years, but the United States let TikTok sort of grow inside the United States. On a pure trade reciprocity basis, I have argued for a long time that that was an unfair thing. We should have done a lot about that earlier. There are national security reasons why the Congress acted on TikTok. But again, the U.S. market remains mostly open with a few very narrow restrictions to everyone, including China. And then it's U.S. firms who are willing to compete in our own home market who are being increasingly restricted. So we have, we have different actions in the 232s that have been taken against Europe. Our trade agreement we're looking to do with Europe tries to deal with this directly. The president has engaged, the vice president has engaged, Ambassador Greer is engaged directly on this. In our agreements on reciprocal trade, we've sought to address this directly. We have, within our Malaysia agreement on reciprocal trade, we have agreements that they would remove sort of VAT tax on U.S. digital trade. We have agreements that we're building in where they support the permanent moratorium on trade restrictions on digital trade through MC14. So it's a priority for us, and it's something whenever I speak to any government, it's the first thing that I speak about. Actually, it's actually my personal priority. I think that if U.S. firms and the U.S. economy is going to really continue to grow in the way it should and really drive prosperity and wealth, not just for the United States, but for the world in leveraging these new tools. Imagine if we let Europe restrict the spread of the internet and how much productivity and wealth creation and knowledge creation has been driven by the internet. If Europe had decided early on the internet, oh, the United States is running away with this thing, I think if they knew then where Google and these guys would end up, they would have done what they're trying to do now. Their playbook is sort of backwards looking. They have a rear view mirror trade policy a lot of times, and their rear view mirror says, oh, the United States beat us with Google and Facebook and Amazon, and we can't let that happen again, right? And so their response is regulatory structures. Their response isn't, what about what the United States did to embrace technology allowed them to create these firms in the first place? And let's see how we can actually have regulatory reform and capital formation reform and labor reform in such a way that we could actually create competitive firms on our own. Instead, they think in a sort of a rear view mirror policy of how do we restrict the U.S.'s ability to do this to us again?
Thank you for that answer. I appreciate that. I want to go to the big picture because I don't want to run out of time without getting there. And so we represent 1,200 American technology companies, a nonprofit association. And for years, we have fought for free trade. We pushed a lot of trade agreements. We appreciate what the USTR has done historically. And lately, we said tariffs. We obviously talked about how we disagree on that. But we've almost switched in a way because we've got the syndrome, I would talk on behalf of many of my members, if not all, and the fact that the government has been so, it's not only the tariffs themselves, executive time has totally changed out of focusing on dealing with all the possible scenarios of rapidly changing tariffs. So I guess the question is, what's the long-term vision here? Where are we going? We know that as a country, we cannot possibly build in the next 10 or 15 or even 20 years the factories that China has, the technology. We don't have the skills, the labor, or the low-cost ability to do that, and we've pushed out a lot of our labor that could help in that. So where are we going? We've argued that we should be working with our allies to share the expertise that we have and have closer bonds with those allies. Many of whom are in this room through various embassies. And we don't feel we're going in that direction. We feel that the relationship with the allies is less close, especially on trade, than it was before. What is the end game here of all these tariffs? Putting aside China, which is its own special case, what do we want to do with the rest of the world? Do we want to have barriers everywhere? Where are we going?
Yeah, again, I sort of, not to be confrontational, I kind of reject the whole premise, right? We have been bringing down barriers to U.S. market access. If you look at the agreements on reciprocal trade, if you look at any of the joint statements we put out, the fundamental approach of USTR has been, yes, the tariffs are there for very good reason in many cases, because we are facing a national security threat directly from these massive trade deficits, which are the result of a trade policy that essentially said the United States will open up to the rest of the world, and we'll let the rest of the world, in most cases, raise up all sorts of non-tariff barriers and other tariff barriers that they have in place, regulatory barriers, phytosanitary barriers, decisions to not let certain products of ours in, very narrow, very specific things around, we put very high taxes on cars by engine size, or we have, very strict phytosanitary regulations that make it so that your ag products can't get in. And so that's where the arts have focused, on trying to open those markets. On the other side, if you look at what we've done with Japan and Korea, we're encouraging our allies to come and invest, right? To say, hey, this market is massive, right? I think here's one of the sort of fundamental pieces, two pieces on this. First of all, the United States has a net negative investment position of $26 trillion. That is a function of trade deficits that have gone on for generations. $26 trillion in net negative investment position for the United States shouldn't happen. You look at how competitive this country is, you look at our technology dominance, you look at our financial services dominance. The only reason we have a net negative investment position of $26 trillion is because we have let this trading system fester for such a long time, where we ran a $1.2 trillion trade deficit last year under the last year of the Biden administration. That is fundamentally destabilizing. At some point, if you have a large enough net negative investment position, even a country like the United States could face some sort of a black swan event where currency devaluation or other things come along. So the president rightly said, hey, that's dangerous. We cannot let that continue forever. And the sooner we look to address this problem, because when you get to a net negative $50 trillion investment position, now you're talking about, a larger than the GDP perhaps of the United States. That becomes really, really problematic. The sooner you deal with that problem, the more likely you are to handle it in a way that is somewhat disruptive, but not really destructive, right? And we're looking to provide a little bit of disruption to prevent future destruction of whole markets. So that's one piece.
Could you just paint a picture 5 to 10 years from now? What does the world look like? The U.S. look like? Is it going to have massive factories everywhere producing pencils and things like that? What do you want to see? So
we want to see a renaissance of industrialization in the United States, of manufacturing. We traded away, and we used, I think, a faulty model of globalization that said that shareholder value maximization at any cost, without anyone looking at the national security and economic security implications of that, is a net benefit for the United States. I reject that premise, right? All of our major trading competitors have industrial policies that say, no, some of these industries are critical. We have to have them there. You can't end up in a world where you have world-class universities and, trillionaire investment folks and a handful of trillionaire, technology people, and no middle class, and a whole huge dependency where we're essentially, this weird, barbell-shaped economy where we export commodities like oil and gas and soybeans, and we have this very powerful finance technology arm and nothing in between. That's a hollow economy. It's very dangerous. And so we need to bring that back. But that isn't saying, it's not a Fortress America approach. Again, if you look at the agreements of reciprocal trade and you look at where the tariffs have landed, they're essentially at what I would call a neutral rate. Right, a neutral rate meaning that it's that if efficiency is applied properly, you could invest in one, say Malaysia, and sell in the United States, or you could invest in the United States with the same factory and sell to the United States, and they'd be roughly in balance. And that's what we're trying to get, is essentially a neutral rate. And there's a reason why the U.S. is unique among global economies, where we actually do need some level of tariff on pretty much everyone. And in order to achieve that neutral rate is because the United States is a $20 trillion consumer economy. That's more than China, who has tons of non-tariff barriers, Europe combined, actually, and you'd probably have to add half of Japan in order to get to what the U.S. consumer market is. What that means is that every single company in the world that's not in the United States says, what's my number one market? For every country, I don't care where you're from, I don't care if you're Singapore or Bangladesh or China, your number one market is the United States. For an American firm, what's your number one market? The United States. So everyone's number one market is the United States. Well, you can't operate in a world where the United States is the most important target of every firm on the planet and expect U.S. firms to compete equally with Malaysia, right? Because there's only so much strategy, so much capital, so much sort of brain power of the C-suite to put on it. So if they're putting most of their focus on the U.S. market and then they think, aha, maybe it's Mexico next, by the time they get to Malaysia, you've got, the third-year associate who's in charge of running that. So what I'm trying to point out is that there's an inherent disparity in the sort of terms of trade, ante, right? Ex-ante for the United States. And this is why we've tried to come at this position where what's the neutral rate? Where does it become pretty much in balance in that it's economically as viable to make the investment in the United States as elsewhere? USMCA, we're going through review, is a huge part of how a U.S. North America-based industrial base would come in. I would say for most of our critical things like semiconductors, steel, a lot of other heavy production things, the United States should domestically produce roughly what we consume, roughly. But that doesn't mean everything we produce gets consumed here. What it means is that we produce it efficiently and we trade it and other folks trade in. But on semiconductors, the United States is sort of, the end sort of consumption place of about 30% of the world's semiconductors. Not if you look at trade flows, but when you look at the final resting place, when the server gets installed, when the car that has them in it when it gets sold, when the laptop or the smartphone gets sold, the United States ends up being almost 30% of all semiconductors consumed, right? But the United States actually only produces about 8% of the world's semiconductors. And even that's really just the actual fabbing of the silicon. It's not the actual finished semiconductor.
Ambassador, I appreciate your courage in coming to this audience, which is probably more free trade oriented than you are. But we recognize that national security is extremely important, but putting everything under that rubric is a bit of a challenge. Thank you for your time. Thanks to the association for having us both.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ambassador Switzer. Thank you, Gary Shapiro. Really appreciate you both making the time to join us here today.